Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Anti-Federalist Radio, providing you with libertarian perspectives and opinions on current events for the liberty-minded. We are taking the fight to the airwaves as we stand for liberty, oppose tyranny, and give equal opportunity in exposing the hypocrisy of the Democrats and the Republicans. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Joe and Joe.
Hey folks, great to be with you tonight. I'm Joe, and your economic host, bringing you together my collective thoughts of 10 years of economic experience with me.
And I am also Joe, your social host. I am a working-class Marine Corps veteran and street-level activist for the Libertarian Party.
So tonight's list and agenda, we're covering Jerome Powell's interview with 60 Minutes. Jerome Powell is the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was appointed there in 2017 by Donald Trump, and he is quite possibly one of the most powerful men alive today in the world, as he controls the monetary levers of economics in our market system, and because of that, throughout the world. So I'll be going into details on that. Joe, did you want to cover the second part with Justin Amash leaving the Libertarian presidential nomination race?
We can both chime in on that. I have a feeling you're a little more informed on it. What I will be diving into is, as promised last week, I am going to go into detail about the libertarian view and positions on the COVID-19 crisis.
All right. So we'll cover that secondary, and then if we've got time, we'll cover Amash's leaving the race and the future state of the Libertarian Party. So opening up with Jerome Powell, Powell's interview was extremely important to me because as an economist, I follow the markets every single day, and especially in relation to what has happened recently in the last 3 months with the COVID-19 crisis. Any person that is not hiding under a rock recognizes that our economy has completely crashed. GDP has contracted in the first quarter by 5%, and it is projected in the second quarter to contract by as much as 30 to 40% among market analysts in some of the world's biggest banks. So with that, I wanted to take a good ear to what Jerome Powell had to say. And I'll be frank with you, it's not because I wanted to go off of the things that he said, but rather I wanted to pay attention to the things that he did not say. It is my fervent belief that during times of crises, and this is the libertarian strain in me, is that whenever elected officials, bureaucrats, and men in power come out to soothe the populace about the crisis, they're usually not as candid. They're not honest. And to give you the most recent frame of mind, in the last economic crash, in 2007, Chairman Alan Greenspan, who was at that time chairman of the Federal Reserve, so he held the exact same position that Jerome Powell has today, when he was questioned about the housing mortgage crisis, Greenspan responded and said that, that there was a bubble, but that it would not cause any kind of lasting damage to the economy. And he gave the same words that most economists give during that time, that we were going through robust health, that the economy was well diversified, and that whatever losses we would take on the, in this matter would not be enough to destroy it, that, America's got the greatest economy in the world, we'd rebound. And obviously history tells the story that Greenspan was dead wrong. Our economy did crash. It collapsed because of the housing bubble. So either Greenspan severely underestimated the damage that the housing bubble would do due to faulty views on economics, or worse, he deliberately knew, but he did not want to incite mass panic, so he basically told you a lie. He basically told us and tried to soothe us and make it seem like it wasn't as bad as he knew that it really was. In other words, he told us what he wanted it to be, not what it actually was. So with that assessment and saying that, I do think that Powell's interview, if you didn't catch it, it's a good one on 60 Minutes. It was within the first 20 minutes of the show. I believe that Jerome Powell was actually fairly candid. I was shocked by that. I was expecting him to paint a rosier picture, and there were a few times that he dodged some questions, and I thought that CBS did a pretty good job interviewing. They were pretty balanced on this. But with that, I jotted down some notes and some quotes that he made, and as well as what he was trying to see coming down the pipeline in the terms of our status in the wake of the crisis. So one of the things that I wanted to note here is that he basically said a couple of things. One was that he said this, and I quote, "The economy was fine before the crash." And so what he meant by that is he talked about how we were going through robust growth. There were no problems. Everything was fine. The markets were doing just like they were supposed to. And then all of a sudden, COVID-19 comes in and ruins everybody's day. And that's why. Now, I can tell you that right there is dishonest. That was one of the few times that he was very dishonest on this. And you might be saying, well, what do you mean? He was basically saying that the markets were functioning just normally, just fine and dandy, without any problems, and then COVID-19 came. That's not true, because if that were true, the Fed would not have had to interject itself inside of the repo markets in the fall through the spring and print over $1 trillion buying assets off the markets. They were buying U.S. equities and government bonds, continuously trying to cycle in money from the markets. And we are getting a ring. Do we have a call on, Pam? No, I'm not seeing any callers, so I'm going to continue on. And so with that, the Federal Reserve had to inject numerous amounts of liquidity, as they call it. We call it in Real Bill USA terms, printing money. They printed money and they bought U.S. bonds, and so they basically flooded the markets with debt to keep the banks afloat. And why did they do that during September? They did it because what's going on? They did it because the interest rates were shooting through the roof, and because of that, that was actually showing that we were actually having a shortage of liquidity. We were actually being oversaturated with debt. And so, the only response that governments and the Fed have in response to this is to basically flood the markets with more debt. It's not working, so we need to do more of it. And that is amounting to kicking the political can down the road. Other things that he said were a little bit more honest coming in. One of the things that he was honest with, he said, we're probably going to have more layoffs through June. So he was expecting that the economy was not going to bottom out until the month of June. So he thinks that in June, that's when, and he's probably timing this with the restrictions on the markets being let up, that's going to be the bottom of the economy. And sure enough, he goes on and says he does expect a rebound in the third quarter. So when the interviewer pressed him and asked him, well, one of the former Fed officials says that the chances of a V-shaped recovery is zero. And that Fed official, I don't know who it was, they didn't name him, but, obviously to hide a source. But he was pretty honest there. He said there's zero chance that we're going through a V-shaped economic recovery. In other words, we're not going to have a sharp bounce back. Our economy is going to stagnate for some time. Powell kind of evaded the question. He didn't really answer it directly. He did say that he would he's trying to be a little bit more optimistic, but he also admitted that he said it could be possible, as in until the end of 2021, before the economy recovers back to normal. Now, the other thing that Powell said, and I think that this is important to illustrate, is that the narrative that is being painted in the mainstream society is that COVID-19, the coronavirus, has been responsible for the economic crash. And this is something where I vehemently disagree. I don't think COVID-19 was responsible for the economic crash. I believe the government shutdowns of the economy in response to the coronavirus was what caused the crash. And that's an important delineation, because Powell then goes on to say, well, part of the things that are going to restrict economic growth is the fears of a vaccine, that there's no vaccine, that the virus could spread, that people would be afraid to go back to work, that people would be afraid to go out to shop, people would be afraid to go out to their sporting events. And there is a ring of truth to it. But if all of that was true, and that was the sole thing that was destroying our economy, then why in the world do we need the government shutdowns? If everybody is doing as they were supposed to do, as the government says we should do, which is socially distancing, staying away from social events, and basically minding our own business and keeping fair distance between each other, then what do we need the government shutdowns for? Surely he's not suggesting that the economy would have crashed by 30%, something that is unprecedented, never has been before seen in our lives, not even during the Great Depression from COVID-19. No, this was because of the government shutdowns of the economy. Otherwise, the government shutdowns are useless, and we should all restrict them and go back to having full liberty again. Allow the economy to naturally recover as it may. So that part is what's being pushed down the mainstream media narrative there, and they're trying to pin the entire blame on the virus rather than the government response to the virus. And this has been one of the number of rules of politicians. So politicians have a number of rules that I kind of mark. First one is to get elected. The second one is to get reelected. And the third one is that when something goes wrong, blame something else or somebody else, preferably the other party. Another thing that Powell was speaking about was things that the government can do and the central bank can do about the crisis. And so he went on to say that $3 trillion, which is about what the government has spent to fight, and I put that in Dr. Evil air crisis, will not be enough. And so Powell basically gave the typical Keynesian economic response that right now is not the time to worry about deficits. It's not the time to worry about debt. It's not time to worry about any type of collapse or crashes in the government finance systems. It's time to spend money promising to turn water into wine, even if you can't, and try to boost people's confidence. Never is the question asked, where does the government get the money? Does the government have a magical money tree growing in its backyard that no one else has that it can just grab from and spend? No. Any dollar that the government spends must come from the private sector first. So if the government is injecting money into the private sector, it had to have already taken that money out of the private sector first. So all the bailouts is nothing more than just bailing the American people out with the American people's money. And so in the end, they try to make the argument, well, it doesn't do any harm because we owe it to ourselves. But the wise conservative columnist, and I can't believe that I'm using that phrase, using wise and conservative, but perhaps the godfather of conservatism himself, William F. Buckley, pointed out that there's a difference in that phrase, we owe it to ourselves, between the we and the ourselves. They're not the same people. We owe it to ourselves. The we is you and me on Main Street. But the ourselves is who's lending the money. And that's the big difference right there. We're the ones that are footing the bill, but it's a party and we're not invited to it. And so there, all the rich, all the wealthy, all the politically connected can get drunk all that they want, but we're the ones who's picking up the bar tab at the end of the day. So, Powell gives the same type of typical Keynesian response that the federal government has to act now, and that it and the Federal Reserve has the tools to limit the damage done in the coronavirus economy. This is completely what's wrong in economic systems today. There you have Jerome Powell, a Republican. CBS pointed out that he was a Republican. He acknowledged that he was a Republican, and he is giving the response that the government can save people from the markets, that government can save the economy by spending more of the people's money. Now, I don't know about you, but that should be a signal that the Republican Party is not really the party of free markets. They may say that they are, but they're not. Ultimately, they behave the exact same way the Democrats do. They spend more money, and when that fails, they spend even more money. So what would be the libertarian response in such a crisis? What would the libertarian president and a libertarian Congress do in the wake of such a crisis? The answer is something that is based off of the age-old adage that the truth hurts, and sometimes it's a hard pill to swallow. And that is, there's nothing the government can do. The more the government does, the worse it makes it. What the libertarian response would be is that the government is already doing too much. We would argue that the government interferences from the state and the federal levels to the regulations of the healthcare markets to the spending of other people's money has made things so expensive, so difficult to produce, that it only hinders the economy. And so what we would argue is that during a time of crisis, government shouldn't increase its spending. It shouldn't bail out people with the people's money. That just drives up prices, and I'll get to that in just a second. What it should do is do the opposite. It should cut spending. It should cut taxes, especially the spending. The spending, government spending, is the tax on society. The more that the government spends, the less wealth that we have, because they have to extract that wealth from us, spend it, and once that dollars are spent, the wealth is used up. It's gone. It's done. It's been used up. There's nothing more produced. The government doesn't produce any goods, and the dollars themselves don't represent anything of value than what we have produced in our economy today. So since government doesn't produce anything, but they spend our dollars, they are nothing more than a group of thieves. We all acknowledge that thieves don't grow the economy. For if a thief took somebody else's money and spent it, we don't say, oh my God, that thief spent my money, look how much he grew it. When somebody takes a rock and chucks it into a window and shatters the window, we don't say, oh my God, that window breaker grew the economy, because now that person who owns that window is going to have to buy another window and spend his hard-earned money. Because we understand that those thieves and that vandalist, just like the government, does not work. They don't produce anything. And so they're not really contributing to the physical economy to which our monetary economy is based off of. And this is something that our leaders inside Washington and at the Fed fail to understand. They have confused the value of the dollar as having some kind of magical power in and of itself. They don't understand that the dollar is merely a piece of paper. It's a medium of exchange. And that's it. The more that they print, the more our currency gets devalued. Now, you might be saying out of this, but our prices haven't gone up yet. The government is allowed to spend, and we've been flooding the markets with debt, yet prices aren't going up, or at least not astronomically. You may be right. Consumer prices aren't going up. They're going up a little bit every single year, 2%, sometimes 3 or 4, but never in the amount that the money supply has increased. And why not? Well, my friends, you can thank the U.S.'s role in the entire world, for that matter. The fact that we have had systems set up in the international markets where we basically lend money internationally. We lend our dollars to international markets. That creates a demand for our currency that otherwise would not have existed. And the reason why that system was set there was because we set it up after World War II. And we set it up on purpose because during that time we believed, or at least that was the excuse that we told everyone and got everybody to buy it hook, line, and sinker, that the United States should be the only currency connected to gold. And so every other world currency in the system, in the banking system, can buy our dollars. And if they buy our dollars, they can then exchange those dollars for gold at any time. But why hold physical gold and have to ship gold back and forth when you can just hold our dollars? And so that was what the system was set up under. When it finally collapsed in the 1970s because the whole thing was a ruse and we couldn't finance all the gold with the dollars that we printed, it just became a floating exchange currency. But because we had struck an agreement with Saudi Arabia to price all oil in U.S. dollars, that means that anytime an investor has to buy oil, they've got to buy our American dollar. And oh, by the way, in many countries around the world, third world countries especially, where their currencies are unstable, they'll often use the U.S. dollar to conduct their financial transactions because they can't trust their own currency. So that also creates a demand for our dollar. And so in the end, we may be printing money, but we're living off of the world's wealth. We're consuming the world's wealth to keep us afloat. So while we, the American consumer, may not experience the damage of what printing money does, believe me, we will soon, one day. If not soon, the world will first. The only thing that we've ensured is that we're the last domino in the chain to fall in the process. But as all dominoes start falling one at a time in a row in succession, all the dominoes will fall. And so this could end up destroying the entire world economic system. Does that mean it's going to happen today or from this crisis? No. It is possible that what we could have is just have a whole bunch of debt to pay off. Debt that can't be paid off, but what it may have done is buy us time. It may have created the idea that we can stay financially solvent for at least the near term. But even if we were to make it through this crisis intact, and I mean this intact with no currencies destroyed, we have a sharp recession, we don't go into a massive depression that lasts for years. Even if we go into this recession, and even if we start bouncing back in the third quarter, which I would find extremely optimistic, extremely very disingenuous. I don't think that's the reality of the system at all. We will still have the problem of these trillions of dollars of debt that we have to finance it with. And how are they going to pay for this debt? By keeping interest rates at zero. And that has a huge negative effect on the economy. For one thing, it reduces the value of savings to nothing. No one can save any money anymore and actually grow their savings in a very risk-free account. We will all have to play the Wall Street casino by investing in overpriced U.S. stocks or bonds that are extremely priced, that give you no interest rate in return because they're at zero, just to even preserve whatever wealth that we have. And in the meantime, the big businesses that are connected to the big banks on Wall Street, whenever they start to fail, the Fed will be the first to bail them out. But for the small and medium-sized businesses and the small and medium-sized banks that aren't connected to the Fed and they're not connected to the government, they will be allowed to fail. And so what will happen is that over time, just like it's happened in the past 3 or 4 decades, is that we will have a continuous increase in oligopoly systems. Our businesses will the big businesses will keep getting bigger. The small and medium-sized businesses will dry up and disappear. Everybody will look around and shrug and say, what happened to the mom and pop's market store? They'll never connect the dots that maybe, just maybe, all the money that was printed made things like land, construction, real estate, bonds, and debt so overpriced that they could not afford it, that all the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of regulations that businesses have to jump through just to start a business, all the licenses and hoops that they have to go through, all the fees they have to pay, all the taxes that they must pay, everything is just too much for small and medium-sized businesses to handle. They can't afford all the accountants for it, for one, just to handle all the litigation and the rules. We'll never make that connection. The American people will honestly never make that connection unless if you and I, the voices of liberty, those who know the truth, make that connection for them. If we point that out to them, maybe then we can get them to open our eyes. So ultimately, what Powell had done here tonight is that he had given the things that I expected him to give, but I was shocked at how candid he was. There was a couple of times that I thought that he was dishonest, but overall, I was expecting him to blow more smoke than he did. Instead, what I saw was just a little bit of steam come out of his ears. And ultimately, even though I wasn't surprised, I was still disappointed by his answers. For someone who claims to be a Republican, the party that is supposed to be the champion of the free market system, they're not. We now know that. He gave an awful response of saying that the only way to get us out of this crisis is for the government to spend more of the people's money and to run up debt. And then he said, don't worry about it now, we'll worry about it later. That was the synopsis of Jerome Powell, and that's really everything that I have to say about it, sad as that may be. So without further ado, let's move on from the economic crisis caused by COVID-19 to the COVID-19 crisis itself.
No,
What's up?
I've got some things to add to your piece.
Yeah. By all means.
So on the subject of the economics of it all, rolling into this, we've had years now of Donald Trump and the Republicans touting the greatest economy that the United States has ever seen. And for as long as they've been saying that, Democrats have been saying that it's actually one of the worst economies that we've ever seen. It's great for the corporations, but it's bad for the working class American. And to an extent, this just boils down to competing political narratives. I have to say it's good, you have to say it's bad. But what the Democrats are getting at and what the blue side and the progressives are getting at is, you'll hear the words corporate socialism thrown out a lot. And, we're bailing out Wall Street, but we're not bailing out Main Street. What they're referring to is that we have structured our economy to privatize gains and privatize profit, but socialize risk.
And socialize
what
losses.
that looks like, and socialize losses. The Libertarian Party platform says, we believe in people's rights to form associations, and it even says the word and form corporations. And we do, in that a corporation is a group of people that get together and form a business. But where I want to draw a line, and the only candidate that I remember doing this in a libertarian debate and pointing this out was Ken Armstrong, is the limited liability corporation. And why that is such a dangerous thing that we have created, and this is where libertarians and progressives see very eye to eye on this one particular matter. We have differing opinions on what to do about it, but if I decide to go into business tomorrow as a sole proprietor, I take out a business loan of $10,000, buy whatever I need, rent out a place, open my doors up. As of this moment, I'm in business in my own name as my own person, but I'm $10,000 in debt. That's what my company's worth. Right now is negative $10,000, and that $10,000 is sunk into my assets, my physical, assets, my equipment and whatnot. And I mopped, and I forgot to put a wet floor sign up, and there's a wet spot right there on the floor, and the first person coming through the door slips and breaks their neck and sues me for $100,000. You're suing me for $100,000 because I am a sole proprietor, and I have assumed that risk. And my company is only worth negative $10,000 right now, but you're coming after me, and I'm going to have to file bankruptcy. With a corporation, in the sense and the way it's used in the Libertarian Party platform, myself and 10 other people went into business together. So we're each sunk $1,000 into this company. When you come after us like this and you've slipped and, injured yourself at our fault, you're essentially coming after all of us, and each of us is going to have to fork over $10,000. So now instead of just me and my sole proprietorship being out $110,000 on my bad investment, 10 of us are out $11,000. With a limited liability corporation, which is such a bizarre concept, myself and my 9 friends have created this business, and now that business is its own entity, its own legal entity with rights, and it acts as a person. And if you walk through the door and slip and break your neck, you're not suing myself and the other investors that make up this corporation. You're suing the corporation itself. And what's the corporation worth? The corporation is worth negative $10,000. This limited liability corporation has negative $10,000 to give you. It's going to liquidate whatever assets it can. It's going to fork over that money to you, either you or its other debtors, that the money that owes the bank. Somebody's just going to lose out on this. But at the end of the day, everyone's safe in the corporation. And you, the consumer, who walked in here and broke your neck, you're the person that actually eats the loss. We have socialized the risk. via limited liability corporation. And this is how we run the American economy. We have decided that if a person goes into business by themselves in their own name, they are at risk for everything. And going back, you look at Marxism and you look at 300 years worth of writings on economics. Oh, what do the bourgeoisie do for society? What do the bourgeoisie do for society? The answer is that the bourgeoisie assume risk. The bourgeoisie put up their own capital and their own name, and if their idea was stupid or something goes wrong, they are the single point of failure. They are the collapse point. They are the ones that are ruined by it, and the rest of society carries on. We have managed to create a bourgeoisie class that gets to enjoy the benefits of winning, but is absolutely safe from loss. It's a really difficult concept to fix when you think of it in terms of the stock market, because if I buy stock in a company, I'm now joining in on the LLC, but I'm only at risk for, the $100 I just threw in to buy stock with you. It's a weird thing to try to conceptualize how to fix, but that's one of the things that's contributed to this house of cards fragile economy we've been running in, is that you have all these companies, these LLCs, that do not need to concern themselves with risk. No single shareholder can be out more than the money they put into it if something goes terribly wrong. The executive officers, obviously, aren't at risk of anything except losing the value of their own stock and being out of a job. And if you get big enough, Congress is not going to let anything bad happen to you. They'll bail you out. So we've created an environment where the risk is socialized. And if the risk is socialized, there's no reason for me to shy away from it. I should take all the risk I can. I should be a quarter-to-quarter company. I should be bold and wild, and if anything goes wrong, everyone else is going to save me. And this is why we have these steep climbing economies, because taking bold risks pays off aggressively. And it's why we have these extraordinary downward crashes, because taking bold risks eventually bites you in the ass. And this is where the Democrats are right, that we have corporate socialism. And the reason this bites the little guy is if you look at an Austrian economic cycle, a free market economic cycle, trickle down economics works. It does get back to you at the end of the cycle. We've got to see the economy climb back up, and the GDP growth we see from this and the consumer spending we see going from a trough of a recession on the climb is if you were just unemployed and you just got a job, you went from your personal consumer spending power went from 0 to $30,000. Like median income $30,000 a year. That's a really big boost to the economy just for you. And we see this everywhere as that unemployment rate starts dropping. But when that unemployment rate gets to about 3.5%, what most economists will tell you is that when your unemployment reaches 3%, the people that don't have jobs aren't out of a job because they can't find one. They're out because they're holding out for a better one. They're out because they're deliberately, by choice between jobs, they're looking for something better. And at that point, the only way in a free market the economy grows is through immigration, graduations, people reaching the age of 18 and joining the workforce, and wage increases. If everybody's got a job and is happy, I can't throw out a minimum wage job and people will flock to it. I now have to pay more than the company next door to get anybody working for me. Now we're seeing growth. But under our current system, as soon as we hit that sudden point where the economy can't just rapidly grow, something comes along and blows it over and topples the whole thing. And where we libertarians disagree with progressives is what Bernie Sanders will say is we're already socializing the corporations. We need to socialize the little guy. What libertarians say is no, we need to just stop socializing anybody. We need to get back to a world where people assume their own risk. And, oh dear, I'm losing my train of thought. Let me gather this back.
Then let me jump in right quick and fill in.
Okay. Go ahead.
No. If you got your thought, go ahead and finish.
I got it. To polish up my point on this and why libertarians lean towards not socializing anything as opposed to we should socialize everything. In a free market system, when there is scarcity, when you have 9 units but 10 people, who doesn't get the unit? The poor person. The price will set. The price point will fall where the 9 people with the most to spend, the 9 units, and the 10th person is out. It's cruel. It's Darwinistic. But that's how a free market works. In a socialist system, we advertise it as there's not scarcity. There's 10 units, 10 people. But sooner or later, the hard times come. And in a socialist system, I'll ask this to anybody listening, when you have 9 units and 10 people, in a socialist system where we are all equal and these decisions are not based upon your income and your net worth, who goes without? You will never get an answer to that question. And you can look at Europe and you can see what actually happens. We saw it in 2008 with the financial crisis when the European Union ran into this problem where there was too much strain on the system and not enough input to it. Greece got left out in the rain. Spain and Ireland barely survived. We fast forward to the migrant crisis produced by ISIS and our withdrawal from Iraq. And as all these migrants flooded in, we've seen rising anti-immigration policy all across Europe. Brexit is a prime example. England literally left the European Union, and the number one reason people listed is because of immigration. When you strain that socialist system, all these people look around and decide the in-group is going to ostracize the out-group. And the people that really needed the socialism are the ones that get left in the rain, and the people that were doing fine on their own, huddle together for warmth. That's why libertarians don't go that way, because eventually when push comes to shove, it looks the same. That's what I got, Joe. Back to you.
Let me flip and complete your cycle of thought. So you pointed out very wisely, and you framed it this way, that what the progressives are arguing for is socialist, and what we are arguing for is not socialist. But on the flip side of that coin, the absence of socialism is capitalism. And here's the reason why, that we're not just merely anti-socialist. We are actually pro-capitalist in libertarian policies, and this is the reason why. You say, well, what's so wrong with socializing losses? You're just socializing the losses of big corporations. We need to socialize losses of everything. This is the problem. Socialists can't understand capitalists because they don't understand the way that profits and loss works. And let me give you the basic example. Profits tell us what works. Losses tell us what doesn't. Socializing losses, that is bailing out losses, does not solve the problem. It ensures that the problems continue, because you are basically divulging resources away from what works to what doesn't. If a company is losing money in the market, it tells us that whatever that company was doing is not working. It's destroying more than it's creating. It's taking up and using more than what it's providing to society. And that's because, as you pointed out, Joe, is that everything is got scarce resources. The socialist does not understand this. The socialist wants to pretend that everything is completely 100% plentiful. And that's not true, because if that were true, the price of everything would be zero. Everything would be free, but it can't be. The common sense saying is there's no such thing as a free lunch. So I just wanted to complete that thought that you had there.
Yep. I'm happy with that. Are we rolling on to the next point, which is COVID-19?
I think we're ready to migrate to COVID-19.
All right. Well, what I wanted to essentially dive into in our practice runs, our unposted, unrecorded practice runs to this podcast, we would constantly talk about the coronavirus and what the libertarian ideas on it were and what we should be doing, because we launched this whole project at the start of all this. And our first call-in last week, who was also named Joe, asked, wanted to talk about that. So we're going to dive into it today. And I got to tell you, if you're not a libertarian, you are going to be very dissatisfied with everything I'm about to say. Because the libertarian answer to COVID-19 is hardly better than shrugging and saying, "I told you so." In a political climate of team snake oil salesman versus placebo effect, we are the party of you should have been eating your vegetables. We don't have an easy, quick fix to this solution because we don't believe there is an easy, quick fix to the solution or an easy, quick fix to this problem. To make my point, your ancestors 100 years ago decided to implement the Federal Reserve. 100 years ago, we decided to shift towards Keynesian economics. And Joe can talk a lot more about this than I can. I'm also in school with an international business major right now, but I only mostly understand these things, and he can really take off on it. But basically, we decided to go from a savings-driven economy to a debt-driven economy. We made the decision that you would no longer save up money and buy your car. You would take out a loan to buy your car. You would no longer save up money and buy your house. You would take out a mortgage. You would no longer save up money and start a business. You would take out a business loan. You don't pay for things with savings. You pay for things with garnishment of future wages. You promise that whoever it is you're going into debt to will get a portion of everything you produce, your wages, for the next X amount of time. And this is advertised as this great thing that allows us to centrally plan our economy and steer it and direct ourselves, rapidly get out of recessions and rapidly get out of depressions. Problem with it is that you can't stop that machine. If I had $10,000 in savings at the start of all this and you shut down the economy, I could have weathered that. And I myself, I'm in a good situation, and I've always been raised up to be terrified of debt. Unfortunately, you have to go into debt. Like I said, this is a debt-driven economy. From time to time, you're going to have to take out a student loan or a loan for this or a loan for that. I'm doing okay, largely because I'm an essential employee and I didn't lose my job. But 100 years ago, if this had happened, we could have weathered this. Everybody would have had some savings tucked away. Some people wouldn't have. Some people would have suffered in this. But a lot of us could have tucked up inside if we needed to. You can't yank the handbrake on a debt-driven economy. You can't tell me I'm not getting my next 2 months' worth of paychecks because I've got debts to pay. I promised a portion of those paychecks to somebody else, and they're still going to be demanding that. And we try to come in and we're making demands, Congress saying we need rent forgiveness, we need student loan forgiveness, we need debt freezing right now. We need to protect the consumer from their debts because we've taken their income away. You're right. We have to do that if we're going to be a debt-driven economy that's frozen. If you're going to force somebody out of work, you do need to protect them from your decision. But then you shaft it up to the landlord. Well, guess what? The landlord didn't have a mountain of capital to buy that property. The landlord took out a mortgage, betting that the income of all his renters was going to keep up with his mortgage and make his money on that. So now he's not getting that rent. He's still getting barked at by the banks. He's still got to give this money to the banks or they're going to want to repossess his property. So now, well, I guess we've got to bail out the mortgages. We've got to bail out the landlords and protect them So now it goes to the bank. Now we're stretching the banks super thin. Banks run on fractional reserve. A bank only has to have 10% of its loans in actual assets. It's an incredibly dangerous system, and eventually you got to bail it out. Well, how do we bail it out? Well, the Fed just prints money, and we throw it at it, and all this eventually cycles back to inflation. What we've managed to do is ensure that the government never actually has to pay its bill, because as it spends, it incurs debt and kind of pays it off in the form of inflation. And this inflation turns into increased tax revenue, not because it's actually increased tax revenue in value, it's just increased in dollars, but that's fine because debt is measured not in value, it's measured in dollars. If I take out a loan of $1,000 and the dollar loses half its value, I don't suddenly owe $2,000. I owe $1,000. That just happens to be worth half as much. Same thing with the federal government and how they spend. Their debt from 50 years ago is not worth nearly what it is because we've inflated the currency so much, and that's how they run away from their problems. Comes back to the little guy because it also deflates your savings. Our entire generation is going to have a much harder time saving for retirement because of all this, because of being frozen out of a job and then watching the government spend and spend and spend. That inflation is going to hit you and your ability to save for retirement. You're going to have to stay in the workforce longer. It's going to keep you in that beat-up old junker when you might have been able to buy a newer car, and it's going to keep you renting a house for 2 more years when you might have been able to save enough to put 10% down and get a mortgage. And this is what we do, because we always have to have a nuclear option to fix our problems. Yes, the libertarian answer, unfortunately, is we should have been eating our vegetables. 100 years ago, we shouldn't have tried to take the quick fix and take the easy way out away from our problems, because we screwed ourselves for decades, for centuries. The short-sightedness of your ancestors has put you into a situation that you don't have an easy way out of. And what are we all having to do? We're looking at the people that are sitting in the same chairs as the ancestors that screwed us and saying, get me a quick fix to this problem. Everywhere you look, government is fucking this up. Joe, what do you got?
On a whole string of great points. One of the things I want to point out is 2 things. One is that, okay, we say, well, the government has intervened and has allowed employees and businesses to basically stave off paying some of their loans. And you wisely pointed out that, overall those loans have still got to be paid back, even if you inject more loans, and if not, banks will come repossess your property. Well, what happens to the bank's revenues during that time? Well, the banks also use that with borrowed money. In other words, the money that they lent you was money that they borrowed either from each other, or money that they borrowed from the Fed, or money that they had raised up through capital that they owned back to their investors. So if they dump their stock, they've got to pay all that cash out to. And so they're on thin margins right now. They're on very, very thin margins, which means if those revenue sources start drying up, the banks can start freezing. So the Fed has jumped in and intervened and has printed trillions of dollars to the banks. And so you pointed out that this will circle back to inflation. And you made a very great point about that. What we are essentially doing is taking away from the wages of our future to spend today. But one of the things that I think that mathematical economists today, which is basically everybody but the Austrian business cycle and classical school economics, they fail to realize that you may be able to take money from the future and spend it today, but you can't take the goods from the future and buy them today. You can only take that money and spend it on today's goods and resources. So you know what happens to the prices of those goods and resources? They go up. And the reason why we are having to take money out to buy a car, to buy for education, to take 10-year loans out for education, to take 30-year loans out and buy mortgages, is because the prices of those things have gone up. And why have they gone up? They've gone up because the government has devalued our currency in order to partially pay for its debt by basically reducing the value of the debt, but at the same time inflating the prices of everything that we buy. And although consumer spending, consumer prices have been going up 1, 2, 3, or 4% per year, which is tolerable among us. Sometimes we don't even notice it most of the time. What isn't going up by a mere 1 to 2 to 3% is your price of your houses that you buy, the prices of the cars that you're paying for, and the prices of education. Things are going up by double digits, and so is healthcare. And all of that is being financed by debt. Even healthcare spending, which insurances are using. They're taking your premiums and then jacking up your premiums every year. You can think of that as a debt payment. You're basically indebted to the insurance company because if you didn't have health insurance, you're not going to be able to pay for those hospital bills on your own. So the whole thing has been a game, a Ponzi scheme of saying, well, we can have our cake and eat it too. And what they forget to tell you is that you're not taking the ingredients with you from the future and using them today. You have to use the existing ingredients, and they just got a whole lot more expensive. So I think that those were some excellent points you made. I just wanted to finish those thoughts there.
And let me, now that I've had a moment to gather the rest of my thoughts on this, keep compounding on it. Government's efforts to protect you in the name of safety have bottlenecked us and strained us even further here. The FDA, the point of the FDA is to obviously ensure that your food and drugs are safe. And we can look at the history, we can look at why we have the FDA. That one specifically goes back to some company was advertising this miracle weight loss drug, and it was a miracle weight loss drug, and people were taking it, losing crazy weight, and realizing that it was literally worms. If I'm not misremembering, basically they were selling worms. You popped a pill, you got worms, you lost weight like crazy, and people were quite upset about this, and we ended up with the FDA, which is a single point. It's a bottleneck where all of our food and all of our drugs has to go through to be inspected and ensured it is safe for human consumption. This is not a bad thing. It's not a bad idea. You know, it's not some great conspiracy to screw the little guy. It was there to protect you, but now it's screwing you. There's 1,000 breweries across the nation that want to produce hand sanitizer, but they can't, because in order to ensure that kids don't buy hand sanitizer and get drunk off of it, it legally has to be poisoned. It has to, I can't remember the word for it, denaturant, something. Basically, you have to mix something into it that makes it, unconsumable to sell it as hand sanitizer so that people under the age of 21 can buy an alcohol product. Breweries, while we've had this shortage of hand sanitizer, want to produce that and want to produce rubbing alcohol. But to put that denaturant into their equipment would ruin the equipment, and they would never be able to brew alcohol again, or at least not for several years, or at least not without a serious cleaning or replacement of the equipment, so breweries are not. And now we're out of hand sanitizer. The free market has a solution right there, but we got to make sure that we poison the stuff so that the kids aren't getting drunk. Now, anybody listening that drinks, I personally don't. If you actually waited until your 21st birthday, well, you're probably lying. No, you didn't. I guarantee you got alcohol when you were a kid. You probably drank it when you were in high school. Hell, your parents probably gave it to you on the porch. That effort, that denaturant to protect kids from doing what kids are going to do, didn't stop you, but it is putting you in greater danger now. This goes on to everything. Con laws, certificate of need laws. We don't have the low-priced medical industry we need because of things like certificate of need laws. Man, if you ever get a libertarian started on certificate of need laws, we will not shut up. Basically, the idea of them is that in an effort to ensure that medical services were spread across a wider area and that rural areas had access to medicine without having to drive 45 minutes to an emergency room, we passed a law that says that you can't have certain kinds of equipment within a geographical footprint of a major hospital. If you want to have this equipment, you can't be right up here. We don't want a whole bunch of different medical facilities downtown and then none out in the sticks. That place gets downtown, and then you have to take your service way out into the sticks. Well, nobody actually takes their service way out into the sticks because there's no money for it. If you're living out in the rural areas, you still have to drive 45 minutes to the emergency room. But when you get into town, you have to go to the local monopoly. That's been the effect of the Certificate of Need laws. They've never been effective. They've never done anything else, but they are blocking the little guy out. I think his name was Dr. Singh. He was starting to make his way around to some of the local libertarian meetings and telling his story. He was trying to sue in North Carolina to be able to open a competing medical facility with lower prices in Winston-Salem. He wanted to offer competitive pricing on medical services in a city, and he couldn't because he was within a hospital's footprint. He went out of business recently because of the COVID-19 shutdown. He could not survive this shutdown. We have once again reinforced the local monopoly in an effort to save everybody. How many people are losing their health insurance right now? Their employer tethered health insurance. How many different ways are you going to pay the bill on this in order to social distance, in order to quarantine? And I'd also like to point out, maybe I'm misunderstanding the purpose of it, but if I'm not mistaken, the whole flatten the curve thing was never about eradicating the virus. We never were that naive. We never thought that flattening the curve and social distancing and wearing masks and shutting down businesses was going to eradicate the virus. The point was avoiding the situation Italy got into, where they had more cases than hospital beds. The goal was to always have fewer cases at any given time than hospital beds. And one thing you're hearing a lot right now is that if you don't take this seriously, we're going to have to do it longer. Actually, the opposite is true. If we don't take it seriously, yes, cases are going to spike. More people are going to get infected faster. More people are going to have the antibodies. And we get to the other side of this faster. We are drawing this entire process out in an effort to stay lower than hospital beds. And if you check the news, I mean, where are the hospitals that have been maxed out? We have overdone this already. It's costing businesses. It's collapsing small businesses. Gold's Gym has had to file bankruptcy. JCPenney has had to file bankruptcy. Logan's Roadhouse has completely closed down all 200-something of their locations, and they had 50,000 employees. That is 50,000 people who are not going to go back to work when we flip the lights back on. We are shooting ourselves in the foot. Reopen the economy is not about haircuts. It's not about stupid shit like that. We are taking this virus seriously. I go to work every day and I wear a mask. I don't go anywhere but work. I haven't seen my grandfather since this started, and he's going downhill. I may never see that man again, and he had a lot to do with raising me. I'm not going to put him at the risk of, I'm exposed to people every day. I very well may be carrying this virus. I may never see my grandfather again. Don't tell me I'm not taking this seriously. I just understand that we are not saving lives. We are trading them. I think that I have effectively represented the libertarian perspective on COVID-19 with that. Joe, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I do. Just a few things, particularly concerning the FDA and its role in our systems today. So the FDA is one of the more controversial aspects of it. And from what I understand, this is, my understanding is that there were probably multiple reasons of why the FDA was created, and it was essentially, and this is the truth about all department agencies, the dirty little secret is that we try to think that these things like the FDA was created one day. One day it didn't exist, and then the next day it did. And what you fail to realize is that usually what happens is that today's departments are renames of earlier smaller bureaus, and what they had was their powers expanded over time. So the FDA was officially formed, if I'm not mistaken, during the FDR administration in the 1930s, but it probably, and I'm almost certain, that it had an earlier name from probably the late 1800s, early 1900s, having to do with regulating food and drugs. But the incident that comes to mind that happened was that there was a patented medication that was created, but either by accident or whatever, it actually had in it a deadly chemical that was used in lubricants and fluids that were used in automobiles or something of that sort. And it actually resulted in the death of like dozens of people. And so because of that horror that was done, whether by mistake or not, the FDA was created to make sure to ensure the safety of all citizens when it comes to those types of drug products as well as food. And on a safety grounds, you can make the argument, I would say, that, you know, government can step in to provide and ensure things for safety. The libertarian argument has been that you can't trust the government worth anything. At the very least, you know, government, you know, things may be created with the best of intentions, but let's assume that we fall ourselves under a tyranny here. What happens to hospitals that decide to serve wounded soldiers that are rebelling against the government? Guess what the FDA is going to do? They're going to make sure that hospital doesn't get any of those life-saving drugs or prescriptions to serve those soldiers. That's if we ever had a secondary civil war. What happens to food? What happens to the food production facilities that, you know, people are buying from in certain areas if they're rebelling? Well, guess what? The FDA would have to approve everything. And so if you have a rebellious militia group against a tyrannical federal government, the government has control of your food supply. The government has control of your medical drugs. They control your life. They are ensuring, whether that was the purpose of it or not, it does not matter. The end result is that they have ensured that you cannot rebel against the government today. You cannot overthrow your system of government today because guess what? They control your food and they control your health care. Now, saying all of that, it wasn't until the 1960s did rules start getting put in place for efficacy laws. So there's two roles that the FDA does. It does safety and it does efficacy. Efficacy is where not only do the pharmaceutical companies and everything have to prove that their product is safe, they then have to prove that it actually works. They can no longer sell you snake oil salesmen. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's good that they can't sell us a product that doesn't work and stuff like that. After all, that's just wasted money. In the process, it takes over a dozen years to go through all the trials just to make sure that it's proven that it's efficient or not before the drug comes out onto the market. And then by the time it comes out onto the market, if it's supposed to be a life-saving drug for cancer, well, there you go. You had 10 years of cancer patients dying because they can't get the drug onto the market. And by the time it comes out onto the market, you've probably got another drug or some other technology coming down the pipeline that would replace it and make it obsolete. So it totally defeats the purpose, and it inflates the cost so much, not because of the cost of doing the trials, but because of the lost revenue that those businesses have to go through of going through years and years and years of not making a dime on their product, but having to spend a fortune to invest in the product. And then we wonder why our pharmaceutical drugs cost 800% and go up so high that, they're in nosebleed territory. That's why. So sooner or later, we are going to have to recognize, and this is something our founders recognize. I always go back to Thomas Jefferson, and I quote this all the time, but it really does serve to solidify the libertarian standpoint. I prefer dangerous liberty over peaceful slavery. I'd rather deal with the problems that come from having too much liberty than with the problems that come from having too little liberty. Those who trade their liberty for security will end up with neither. But those who trade their security for liberty will end up with a share of both. Give me liberty or give me death. The libertarian standpoint has never been that we will have the utopia if we get government out of the way. What the libertarian standpoint understands is that when the government gets in the way, things inevitably become worse than what they were before. You might have problems before, but whatever the government solution is going to be is usually worse than the problem. This is a cure that's worse than the disease. And when it comes to COVID-19 and the government's response to this, it may very well be that the government might save some lives with forcing an economic shutdown. But as Joe pointed out, the other Joe, you're activist, I'm your economic host, we're not really saving lives, we're trading lives. There are going to be people who die because they cannot get access to needed things. Like, to give you an example, breast cancer treatments have been deemed non-essential. I'm sorry, breast cancer screenings. They've been deemed non-essential. Well, what happens in 6 months when a woman goes back, gets her breast checked, and all of a sudden it turns out she's got cancer? Her chances of survival have been greatly diminished. And yet what's going to happen on that woman's death certificate, should she pass away, is not going to be this woman died because she did not get a breast cancer screening 6 months before because the government shut it down. It will say this woman died of breast cancer. Has nothing to do with COVID-19. And yet really she will probably be a fatality because she didn't get her breast cancer screening in time that she could have had if we were under a free market system. And there are numerous others that will go and die from this, that will be marked in the gravestones and says this person died of this illness, but no one will make the connection that it was because the government shut it down and deemed that medical treatment as non-essential. And so what has gone on is that a lot of hospitals in the rural areas have been closing shop or have been furloughing workers or have been cutting back because they're not getting an influx of COVID-19 patients. And yet our government, controlling the economic system, controlling the medical system, has said that COVID-19 is the most important thing ever, devote everything to it, and everything else comes secondary. And, oh, by the way, these procedures, A, B, C, X, Y, Z, they're not important. Shut them down. And yet what we will probably have from this is fatalities resulting from this because our government does not contain the knowledge of what's best for our society. Only you and I contain that knowledge. And that's everything I've got for that bit.
Do we have time to talk about Amash?
I think so.
Roll with it.
You want me to? All right. So this last week that came into it, Justin Amash, and in case of, just to recap you on what happened, Justin Amash is a congressional representative for the U.S. Congress. He's in the House of Representatives. He was a former Republican, and he about 11 months ago, about 10 or 11 months ago, he had changed his party affiliation to independent. He became fed up with the Republican Party, particularly revolving around Donald Trump. And one of the major contentious issues, which I think is probably the straw that broke the camel's back, was the Mueller investigation onto whether there was Russian interference in the 2016 election and whether they were backing Donald Trump and whether the Trump administration had been working together with the Russians or not. Well, Amash was convinced by the Mueller report that Donald Trump was. So he actually voted for an impeachment of Donald Trump. And predictably, this led to a fallout between Amash and the Republican Party. He probably lost a lot of his Republican support. He became fed up. He goes independent. Well, Amash has always had some libertarian leanings in many ways. His economic, I would say, maybe not his policies, maybe not his voting record per se, but his thoughts have at least been libertarian in nature. He understands the economic philosophies of Frederick Hayek, which is one of the major founders of libertarian economic thought. Frederick Hayek was one of the primary men responsible for creating the Austrian business cycle theory, the idea that influxing a market with debt has severe ramifications in our economy, where it basically creates a system that debt becomes unsustainable because you can't pay it all back. It inevitably redistributes resources from productive markets to unproductive markets, and then that over time deteriorates the economic structure that then causes the system to crash. But enough of that. going back to Amash on this, Amash decides to switch his party affiliation to Libertarian. And from that point on, he had launched an exploratory committee for the presidential nomination a couple of weeks ago. And now, just now, he's decided to leave the Libertarian presidential nomination race. I think he's going to keep his party identification. He just believed that, he going for the president wasn't the best option for him right now. He wanted to support the party the best way he could, but he believed that did not involve him becoming the presidential nominee, which has left the presidential race, the nomination race on the LP side, completely wide open. It's left it to the point now where it was basically a lot of internal thoughts, myself included, believed that, Amash had this. He was going to be the nominee. He was very popular. He had a lot of support. There was a lot of generation of enthusiasm around him. He also drew a lot of criticism mostly because of his late entry into the race, and some of the positions that he took did not really seem to be libertarian in nature. They rather seemed to be still from a Republican standpoint, a conservative Republican standpoint. But, a lot of times people were willing to forgive that because he did have some libertarian stances on other issues, and because he was at least willing to take on the libertarian mantle to run. And now that Amash is out, it's basically a wide open race between Jacob Hornberger, Adam Kokesh, Vermin Supreme, Joe Jurgensen, John Mons, and Judge Jim Gray. And with that being said, the LP Party of Kentucky has been working with numerous groups. So one of the things they worked with was the Mises Caucus. And then just yesterday, they decided to work with Reason Magazine in having debates. And they've had debates among the party leaders who have been attending that have been running for the nomination. And so now the choice is wide open. So with that and Justin leaving, there's now basically a vacuum again that first was created, in my opinion, when Kim Ruff left. In my opinion, Kim Ruff would have been probably the best candidate that we would have been able to generate for libertarians. When Ruff left, it left the field wide open, and then Justin Amash makes his late entry just a couple of weeks ago. Now that he's gone, the field is wide open again. So now it's, players take your bets. Here, everybody place them where they may. It's really up in the air. So, Joe, did you happen to catch that debate last night?
I did not, know.
There's like 18 of them now. This is beginning to turn out like this is beginning to turn out like the 2011 Republican primaries, where there was a debate every other week. In this case, they've been having a debate every other day. With the Libertarian Convention that's been scheduled to happen in the next week and a half, or no, actually, I think it's this next weekend, isn't it?
Oh, it's so up in the air. I think it was going to be May 23rd. I don't know what it is
That's
now.
Right.
It's been hard to follow.
Saturday. Did they delay it? Either way.
Initially.
Either way, it's coming up. So even if it doesn't happen on Memorial Day weekend, which it may not, they may decide to wait until early June, or maybe until the states decide to relax restrictions where they can have numerous people go to these kinds of organizations again in mid to late June. You have certain segments of the Libertarian Party carved out. So to be frank, I would say that you've got, in my opinion, there seems to be three groups, three segments or wings of the Libertarian Party. You've got your anarcho side, which are mostly 99% of them are anarcho-capitalists, but there's a couple of wing groups called anarcho-communists, and they seem to be split between Jacob Hornberger and Vermin Supreme. I would say that the anarchist team seems to side with Vermin Supreme, and Kim Ruff, who was the nominee that I backed, she had thrown her support behind Vermin Supreme. So her affiliation seemed that Supreme would have been at least maybe if she didn't think he was the most qualified, she probably did. Otherwise, she wouldn't support him. But he seemed to be the best person to take on the role of the presidential nominee this cycle. In the Mises caucus, which also is comprised of anarcho-capitalists as well as very, very right-wing economic side libertarians who believe in if they believe in existence of a federal government at all, it is restricted to bare bones, where government is not in charge of Social Security, not in charge of Medicare. There is no Medicare, there is no Medicaid, there's no welfare. And if there is a military, it is bare bones military. And that's basically the only function of it. They've pretty much thrown their support behind Jacob Hornberger, who is essentially what I just described. He's just, in terms of, in terms of how big of a libertarian he is probably just smaller of the L, meaning that he believes in some form of government, just slightly smaller than the anarcho-capitalist. So he does believe there is a function for government, but it is to be reduced to bare bones, and Hornberger is advocating a reduction in government immediately. So immediately he wants to start slashing the government spending on everything by the trillions to reduce it back down, abolishing Medicare, Social Security, welfare, and the Department of Defense and most of the military in months. The Mises Caucus has, endorsed Hornberger, but they've also been split and have also endorsed Vermin Supreme's vice presidential candidate Spike Cohen, who is also anarcho-capitalist and well-versed in libertarian economics. That's your economic wing there. Then in the central part of it, there's probably a middle libertarian wing. Part seems to be very balanced, in my opinion. To me, I think that's where Kim Ruff was. I think she was a middle. She definitely wanted to strongly reduce the size of government, but in a personal interview, not really an interview, I Facebook chatted with her about 6-7 months ago about her role that she would take as president. She definitely wanted to bring the troops home. She definitely wanted to legalize the drugs. She definitely wanted to reduce the size of government, but she also understood that as president and being a sole soldier there, her hands were going to be tied behind her back. There was only so much that she could do in a limited amount of time, but essentially she was going to hold the line. She was going to hold the line, cut government wherever she can, veto every single spending bill that came across wherever she could, and basically hold herself straight. And I very much respected her. To that, I would add Jo Jorgensen, who was the vice presidential candidate to Harry Brown back in 1996. She seems to be taking on that role as sort of the middle L, the middle side. And then lastly, and then to that, I would probably add John Moss, who is an African-American who has been very active down in Georgia. He ran for the Georgia governor position. He's also run for some local positions down there. John Mon seems to hold that side there. And then in the small L department, I would say falls where I would have put Justin Amash definitely, and Judge Jim Gray, as well as Gray's vice presidential counterpart, Larry Sharp. And those are people that I would call incrementalist. They want to roll back government, but they want to roll back government one piece at a time, and usually very slow. And those may be called, in quotes, pragmatists. They're the most pragmatic of the group, but they try to say that they're taking a realistic approach to things and saying that we can't have it all at once. We didn't get into this overnight. We're not going to get out of this overnight. So they often talk about, small cuts in government, but over time they would add up and they would just continue cutting back. And then lastly, of course, finally, I'm sorry, I skipped over a person, was Adam Kokesh. And Adam Kokesh has been an interesting figure, definitely on the big L side. He has been someone who, as president, he wanted to go ahead and just say, well, the federal government just needs to declare bankruptcy and dissolve itself. And he often called himself, I think he did a little bit of tongue-in-cheek here, he would call himself the bankruptcy agent-in-chief and such. And so basically he said as the role of the president is just to manage the bankruptcy of the United States because it is unable to pay its debts, and doing so would release, so much resources back into the economy to grow it. And so now the field has been wide open, so we're playing our bets here on who's going to become the nominee. And I've got my own personal thoughts on who I think the support is going to be thrown behind now as far as the delegates and who our nominee is going to be. Joe, do you have any personal musings on who you think the nominee is going to be now and the direction that's going to take the Libertarian Party?
Allow me to first lead with, if you are a Republican or Democrat or an independent and you're now rolling into this election trying to decide which draft-dodging, war-mongering sexual predator is the lesser of the two evils, the Libertarian Party's got a really, really strong field right now. I mean, I like a lot of people running, and I'm in the same boat as you. I don't believe in personality cults. I don't believe you should ever just completely be on board with any politician, but I was heart and soul in for Kim Ruff. And if she ever runs for office, unless a back-from-the-dead Patrick Henry with a back-from-the-dead Frederick Hayek as his running mate is running against her, I will vote for Kim Ruff against anybody. With her out of it, I am in Vermin Supreme's camp. And anyone that thinks that's absurd, I'm not going to defend Supreme. I'm not going to go down that road. Either watch a debate with him or leave me alone because he's great. Aside from him, I mean, Hornberger, policy and philosophy-wise, I love everything of Hornberger. I just don't like Hornberger himself. There's much to be said about that, but I won't go any further into it. Judge Gray is pretty solid. John Mons is solid. Joe Jorgensen's good. Adam Kokesh is good. We've got a great field. For vice presidents even, Spike Cohen is fantastic. Spike Cohen is great. Ken Armstrong was running for president. He has instead shifted to declare that he is running for vice president. And Ken Armstrong is fantastic. Like him on Facebook. Watch what he says. He's the one I mentioned earlier. He was the only libertarian I've ever seen that kind of pointed out the bullshit with how corporations exist in the United States as people with rights. God, we've got a great platform. We got a lot of good people. And I had a lot of bad to say about Justin Amash because I don't like that in the last minute he jumped from the independents, still basically leaning Republican, to Libertarian and said, hey, I'm quarterback now, give me the ball. He is still small L, and I am still big L, but I am happy to see that he has withdrawn his presidential bid. That's where I wanted to see him. I don't ever want to discourage anybody from jumping ship. I don't think you should be our immediately, leader by default. But I'm happy to have him here. I'm happy that now that he is withdrawn, we do not have the option of being Republican light again this year. We have to put a Libertarian forward. I appreciate that. Who do I think's going to get it? Hornberger. I think Jacob Hornberger is going to be the nominee.
Interesting. So I watched the debate last night. I'm just going to give you my thoughts on this one. I think the people who performed the strongest, and this is going to come as a shock, we'll let me preface this, is that this person I'm about to say that I think had the strongest debate performance last night is someone that I was never particularly excited about. Now, let me be clear here. As Joe pointed out, all the candidates here about the Libertarian Party, and one of the things that I think is the Libertarian Party's strong point, is that the candidates, and this is the key word in candidates, they're very candid. They're very honest. Now, some I think are more honest than others, but I find it a breath of fresh air compared to the scumbags who will lie to you every single day of the week and things inside the Republican and Democrat Party. And to contrast myself with Joe here, I was a former Republican. I voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and I had Trump lie to me every single day, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker. And it wasn't until after he became president and he started flipping on everything that he said, on his stances on things, that I realized I was hoodwinked. So I think that the honesty of these candidates was strongest. But the person I'm going to say that I think actually did the best in the debate and helped herself was Jo Jorgensen. And Jo Jorgensen, to give you a little bit of framework, she was the person I put into the medium L category. She seems very balanced, much like Kim Ruff was. She wanted to cut back government, and she believed that there were things that we needed to do immediately, but she also recognized that there were limits to what she could do, and more or less realized that, you know, the actions that we take have consequences, positive and negative, mostly all positive in the long run, but sometimes you can have some negative issues in the short run. And she seemed to be just much more careful with what she could promise, which I respect, because I'd rather have somebody tell me what they are going to do and what they can do versus someone who can tell me what they want to do and they can't do, because they never tell you that they can't do it. So I thought she did very strong. So here's what she had brought on as her points in debate. She said she wanted to eliminate the Department of Education. That was something that she had concentrated on so much. I don't know why she really was hell-bent on that, but I guess that she had a problem, and I agree with her 100%, that the federal government's involvement in education is completely destructive. And if you think that it's
and
not,
because libertarians win school boards. Sorry to cut you off. That isn't like, if you dive in and look, oh, well, where are the elected libertarians? I'm not joking. School boards. Man, when you get up in front of parents and we start talking, we win school board seats. That's why she went on in education.
Well, one of the things that I know of is that, you know, she takes the role that the federal government shouldn't be involved in education, and not just because of the funding aspects of it, but because that also gives the federal government a pipeline to controlling what educates your students, what educates our children, and that's a real problem because that's a one-way ticket propaganda bill. So she concentrated on that. She was the one who pointed out that the drug laws today have to prove to be both safe for safety and efficacy of the FDA, and you know she also pointed out that before 1962. They only had to prove safety. So I think where her stance was going to be taken was to roll back the FDA, at least down to the point where it says, all right, maybe you can prove that we only have to have safety, but the efficacy rules are eliminated. And do I like that? No, because I'm like Joe, I'm more of a big L person, but I think that was the standpoint that she was taking to start off with. And to start off with, if the FDA ever got rolled back to that point, that's a hell of a start. But one of the things that she took a strong point on was that she pointed out that the Fed is an abomination, that it actually caused the Depression with its monetary policies, which is something that I agree with. So she won big points there. But the major thing that she pointed out that I think that really won her on this was the roles of how to bring the troops home. So every single person on there, with the exception of Jim Gray, which I was very disappointed in Gray on, was talking about how we need to bring the troops home from the foreign bases right away. Well, Jurgensen realized, as well as Gray did, but she was much more she took a stronger stance than Gray did. It is not as simple as just ordering all troops to come home. There's a systemic process to ending those facilities, to bringing everything home, to making sure all the equipment is packed up and moved out, things that take months of preparation, therefore. And she seemed to pretty much systematically lay out a plan of where to withdraw from first. What?
Sorry,
what
I had some audio issues. You're good. I didn't say anything. I just had a little bit of a technical issue.
Sure. So case in point, she pointed out, is like first place to get rid of the bases, Europe. World War II is over. The Cold War's over. I was like, yes. And then she was like, next place that we'd start rolling back would be Japan and Korea, because those wars are over. And then, and then proceed on from there. And then the last place would be the Middle East, but she, did it in stages, one at a time. And that was something that was more detailed than the others. Everybody else just pretty much said, we'll bring the troops home. And I was like, well, how? And I prefer details because the devil's in the details. One of the things that hurt Jim Gray, I thought Gray did not help himself. He probably burned some bridges here, is that his advocacy for reducing government was to audit agencies and roll them back incrementally. Now, this is something I want your opinion on, Joe. What's your opinion on that? If he says my plan is to audit agencies and roll them back incrementally, do you have any objections to that?
Yeah, it's overseers overseeing the overseers, and
that's exactly
you would
right.
not. If you've ever been a part of the government, which anybody in the military has, it's every time we see an agency in the fire for something, there's this scramble for everyone to demonstrate that they did their job properly and shift the blame elsewhere. You'll just
100.
You just won't really pin anything on them. Auditing, rolling them back incrementally, I understand, because you can't just cut the lights off one day, make this thing completely cease to exist. It's a fundamental part of our economic system currently. Not a good part. It exists like a tumor, but you still, as a surgeon, have to go in and carefully remove a tumor.
Yep.
That's how a federal agency is going to work. So I get that, but auditing them, I don't really see the value of. Just fucking get rid of them.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. So when I said that, I'm all for someone who is balanced on what they can do. Departments are a little bit different. They're something that they are directly under the control of the executive branch. The department should be eliminated ASAP. If the government does not have a legitimate role, which in my opinion is to provide for the defense of the people, they need to be eliminated, gone. Anything that they are doing, if something is allocated, and I'll throw this one out as a bone. Under the Department of Energy, they manage the nuclear weapons. There's funding for nuclear weapons in the Department of Energy. Why? I don't know. We're not using them for nuclear materials for power plants, but it is. It's about $8 billion. That can be allocated under the Department of Defense, and other than that, we really shouldn't have a Department of Energy. We shouldn't have a Department of Education or anything. Those things just need to be eliminated. But if you were going to keep them, the best way to do that wouldn't be to audit them. It's to have a third outside group conduct a cost-benefit analysis. The ones who, conclude that says, the benefits exceed the cost, keep. The parts that say, no, the cost outweigh the benefits, eliminate. And at least then you can say, well, we conducted this third-party analysis from this group that had no part in this. They weren't a government agency. We hired them. They conducted by their analysis A, B, C, X, Y, Z. That's the way to do it. But Gray did not take that point. And I think the part that nailed him in the head was when he made the quote. He said that he would listen to the medical experts on COVID-19. And I think that hurt because last time I checked, the medical experts were the ones that told us to shut down the entire economy. I mean, that one I just can't get around on.
I'm going to break ranks with you. Listen to the medical experts, absolutely. Don't pretend this virus is not a thing to be taken seriously. But let's emphasize, listen to the experts. Yes, listen to the experts. A pathogen expert, an expert on infectious diseases, is not an expert on economics and the consequences thereof. This is why when you have somebody in an executive position, they are surrounded by differing experts. And it's why we've always praised leaders historically that surrounded themselves not with their friends, differently with them. Yes, absolutely listen to the medical expert. You need to know what that person has to say in this kind of situation, but you need to have an economist across from them. So when the medical expert tells you this is what I think we should do. The medical expert is going to tell you what they think you need to do from a medical standpoint. And in the name of medicine, you probably should shut the economy down. And then you look at your economist and you say, what's that going to do? And the economist is going to go, that's going to be a terrible idea and kill a lot of people. And now you're having a three-way discussion between yourself, an economics expert, and a medical expert coming up with a solution. Yes, you should listen to the medical expert. Put the mask on.
And I'm not
Put the mask
I'm not
on
advocating. I'm not advocating to ignore medical experts, and I don't think Gray was on that one. If that's what he meant, then I clarify that was the right stance to take. But I agree with you that when it comes to saying, well, this is a disease that spreads rapidly, here's ways to reduce it. But as a president, your concern is not really with economics, nor as much as we talk about it, it's always involved, nor is it with the medical safety of the people. It is whether you are defending the liberties of the people. That's what you're there and elected for. You are there to preserve the liberties of those people. Your role should be to protect your people from anybody or anything or any organization or any country that dares to take their liberties away. In this case, it's the government itself. So if your economist comes out and says, well, sir, I think your best policy to generate the most economic growth is to regulate and control the people as president, you should be saying no. Why? It infringes on their liberties. If a medical expert comes out and says, sir, we've got this rampant disease, the best thing to do is to shut everybody down, send them home, no. Why? It infringes on their liberties. But then you might say, well, what if that does save lives? This is based off the mentality that people are stupid, that we cannot take care of ourselves, that we need Big Brother to watch over us. And that's the problem, is that there may be some truth, that somewhere, somehow, there may be a government expert that knows more than we do, that could possibly save one life that otherwise would not have been saved. But the problem is that when you give those liberties up to the government, they will not give it back, and they will not give it back so easily. And it gives them the precedent to use it as a force of tyranny in the future. That's the threat they possess now. But yes, you're right, Joe. If that's what he meant by listening to the medical experts, I stand correct. Jim Gray was right there. Hornberger, of course, took the route, bring all troops home and discharge them right away, end Social Security, end all welfare, eliminate all departments. That part I don't think is realistic, and I wish he was a little bit more realistic on what he could do. But here's the part that I think Hornberger did the strongest on. He said that when it came time for the national debt to be raised, he was just saying, I'm not going to raise the debt. I'll veto every single spending bill. And he's absolutely right. I think that the government can and should do that, and by doing that, it would force a balanced budget and force the government to cut a third of its wealth right away. And Mons, I thought, did well. He took Jurgensen's role. Some people had pointed out on the stream, on the comments, that Mons seems to be positioning himself to be Jurgensen's running mate, because he basically echoed everything she said. And then, of course, Kokesh was up at the top on his own, and in typical Kokesh fashion, this was a virtual debate, so everybody's sitting in front of their computers. But Kokesh would write down his comments on a whiteboard, and then he would show up the whiteboard to the screen while other people were speaking. So his major thing was that he disagreed with Gray on just about everything. So when Gray was talking, what's that? What's that?
You're good. Keep going. You're good.
Yeah, so when Jim Gray was talking, he would start talking about, well, I'm not going to bring all the troops home all at once. And then Kokesh would, write something up that says, #bring all the troops home, don't trust Gray or something, and just try to pick a fight. That is typical Adam Kokesh. So overall, I thought the debate was good. I thought Kokesh did very well in debate, but I thought the person who helped herself the most was Jurgensen. And I said all that to say this, is that if I were to throw my money behind somebody, if I were a betting man, I bet Jurgensen's going to get the nomination, unless if she does something stupid. I would say that the ball's on her court now. If she gets it, I'll
campaign for her. I will happily campaign for Jo Jorgensen. I will jump behind her in a heartbeat.
I've never been someone that has been warmed to her, but I warmed up to her last night. I was surprised. Because before, Jurgensen she has the same problems that Hornberger has, but they're the exact opposite issues. They don't warm up to me. I like the things that Hornberger stands on, but he wasn't warming up to me. But the reason why he wasn't warming up to me was the pitch and tone he would take. He would constantly complain. Jurgensen, on the other hand, it was just something like, I agree with everything that you say, but you know what? You're just not budging it for me. But last night, she was a little bit less pointed and a little bit more passionate, put a little bit more emotion, but more strength. So I thought she did well. But anyway,
sounds good. I'll jump.
If you guys want to catch that debate, you can YouTube it and just YouTube the Libertarian Party debate for Reason TV. And Reason TV was the one that was hosting it. It's a good debate. It's about 2 hours long. And I'm sure there will be more in the coming weeks. But once we start getting the nominee down, we will be able to hammer out a policy platform that we can take for the presidential race. And right now, the third-party candidate, which is unnamed right now, is polling at about 4% in the national polls. And although that may seem weak, that's not bad considering that we don't have a name. There's no name, no face for the people to recognize, and there's already 4%, that are just saying, I'm definitely voting for somebody else. My opinion, once we get a name and face to put on that, it can only go up. So that we can hope to do that and hope we can make a strong third-party performance in the coming race. Joe, do you have anything to add before we close up?
I've got nothing to add.
All right. Anything coming down that you want to talk with next week?
I've got some activism-y things coming up, so hopefully I won't be broadcasting from a jail cell.
Right. Well, guys, that's all that we have for today. Just tune in next week, and we will cover with something interesting. We will post on our Facebook any kind of articles that we find interesting, and I'm sure that as states start reopening up, we might want to do a little bit of a deep in onto what states have opened up and their status and how they have fared with COVID-19 versus the states that have not, and see if the medical experts were right. Did we see a resurgence in the COVID-19 cases? What's that going to mean for our economy if we did get a resurgence? Will the government try to shut things down again? And if so, what that's going to be like? And also with more economic news. One of the things that is definitely coming down is that the default rates are going to come out for the first quarter of 2020. I'm going to dig into those numbers because that will tell us a lot about how much of our economy has remained solvent. We already know that our economy is in recession, but essentially speaking, if our businesses and banks are staying financially solvent, that's a big sign that what's going to transpire is more of a recession rather than a depression. So stay tuned, and thank you for listening. You can follow us on Facebook at Anti-Federalist Radio, and you can also reach out to us at email at antifederalistradio@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, guys. Be part of liberty, and good night.